How could a mountain seem to split open in a single night? Was there a quake hiding in the dark, or did the cliff simply reveal a weakness that had been there all along? And if a granite wall in Yosemite can crack so fast that climbers find it changed within days, what does that say about the forces still working inside one of the most famous landscapes on Earth? In mid-August of 2023, that was the shock at Royal Arches in Yosemite Valley. A narrow fissure appeared in a steep granite face, and, in the span of what seemed like almost no time at all, turned into a conspicuous break that ran roughly 200 feet, or about 61 meters, up the cliff. It was not a clean split like a knife through wood. It was jagged, uneven, and alive with motion. Climbers and rangers did not just see the crack, they heard it. The rock was making noise as it moved, a kind of grinding, creaking, settling sound that suggested the slab was not simply broken, but actively detaching. That is the key to understanding why this event mattered. It was not only a crack, it was a crack in the middle of a process. Geologically, what people were looking at was not a random wound in the cliff face, but a fracture along a pre-existing weakness in the granite, most likely a sheeting joint or exfoliation fracture. In plain terms, this is a break that runs roughly parallel to the rock surface. These joints matter because they create the kind of large plate-like blocks that can peel away from a cliff in one piece, or at least in a huge part of one piece. In Yosemite, that process is common enough to be part of the park's identity. Royal Arches itself is one of the textbook expressions of this style of erosion. The curving ledges and broad flake-like surfaces in the area reflect the way granite in Yosemite tends to split along layered, sheet-like fractures instead of crumbling into small bits. So when a crack opens in Royal Arches, the danger is not just that the crack exists. The danger is that it may be outlining a block that has already begun to separate from the wall. That is what made the crack look so alarming from the start. It had the visual language of a rockfall in progress. It ran through a prominent pillar of rock and marked off a section of cliff that was no longer fully tied into the mountain. That means the geometry of the cliff itself had changed. A stable wall and a partially detached slab are not the same thing. The first can stand for a long time. The second can fail when its internal connections weaken just a little more. In Yosemite, that distinction is critical because the valley walls are steep, high, and already fractured. A block that is hanging from a cliff face may not fall the moment a crack appears, but once the crack is large enough, the margin of safety can become very small. To understand why the crack opened there at all, the story has to begin deep underground, long before Yosemite existed in anything like its present form. The granite of Yosemite is part of the Sierra Nevada batholith, a vast body of plutonic rock formed from magma that cooled slowly beneath the Earth's surface. This is not volcanic rock that erupted at the surface and froze quickly. It is intrusive granite, built grain by grain under intense pressure and at depth. That slow cooling gave the rock its interlocking crystals and its strength. The majority of Yosemite's granites formed during the Cretaceous period, around 105 to 85 million years ago. The rock was born deep below the surface and only much later became visible after the overlying material was stripped away by erosion and uplift. That earlier history matters because the granite was not created in a blank, intact block. As it formed, and as the Sierra Nevada evolved, tectonic stress and later erosion helped create fractures within the rock. Those fractures may not have looked impressive when the granite was still buried, but they became the roads along which later weathering and fracture growth could move. Granite is strong, but it is not perfect. It contains planes of weakness. Once those planes exist, later forces do not need to invent a crack from scratch. They only need to exploit what is already there. Then came glaciation, which changed everything again. As the climate cooled over the last several million years, glaciers advanced and retreated across the range. In Yosemite, ice deepened and widened valleys, steepened walls, and stripped away huge amounts of rock. The last major episode of glaciation reached its maximum roughly 18,000 years ago. The valley we see today is, in large part, a glacial sculpture. The cliffs are steep because ice cut beside them and below them, and because earlier rock surfaces were removed, leaving the hard granite exposed. That is important because once the overburden is gone, the rock responds differently. Deep rock that has been under high confining pressure for millions of years is suddenly exposed to lower pressure near the surface. That release can allow the outer layers to relax and fracture in new ways. This is where exfoliation comes in. Exfoliation is the process by which large slabs of rock break and peel away along curved, parallel joints. It is often compared to the peeling skin of an onion, but in granite it is not soft skin coming off. It is a mass of stone tearing away in broad sheets. The cause is not one single force. It is the interaction of unloading, joint formation, weathering, and thermal stress. When deep granite is exposed at the surface, it can expand slightly as pressure is removed. That expansion encourages fractures that parallel the surface. Over time, those fractures become sheet joints. If conditions continue to weaken the rock along those joints, the outer slab can loosen and detach. Royal arches and half dome are classic Yosemite examples of this behavior. Their shapes are not only the result of glaciers carving the landscape. They are also the result of granite peeling apart along curved fractures. In the case of royal arches, the name itself reflects that layered arching structure. The rock face is not a uniform slab. It is a history of repeated separation surfaces, each one marking a place where the mountain has already begun to shed material. That is why a crack there is so geologically meaningful. It is not an isolated flaw. It is a visible continuation of a long process that has shaped the whole wall. The question then becomes, why did this particular crack appear so abruptly? Why did climbers report that nothing was there on one visit, and then find a long fissure 2 weeks later? The answer likely lies in the fact that fractures can grow quietly for a long time before they become visible from a distance. A crack may already exist inside the rock before the opening reaches the surface. Stress can accumulate for years. Then, when the conditions are right, the joint can suddenly propagate. In a cliff like Royal Arches, that propagation can happen in a way that looks almost instantaneous to people on the ground. In reality, the process may have been building invisibly for a long time. Several triggers can help push that process forward. Water is one. If it enters fractures, it can increase pressure and weaken the contact surfaces. If it freezes, it expands and pries the crack wider. This is frost wedging, a classic rock-breaking process. Vegetation can do something similar on a slower time scale, with roots growing into joints and forcing them open. Earthquakes can also shake a slab loose by applying sudden stress to already unstable rock. But in this case, there was no obvious sign that a major quake or storm caused the initial opening. That is why many geologists focused instead on thermal stress, especially because the crack developed in the heat of summer. Thermal stress is easy to underestimate because it works in small increments. Granite expands when heated and contracts when cooled. Those changes may be tiny on a single cycle, but the cliff face does not experience just one cycle. It experiences daily heating and cooling, week after week, season after season. Surface rock warms faster than rock deeper inside the cliff, so the outer layer wants to expand, while the inner part lags behind. That creates bending stress. If there is already a crack or joint, that stress concentrates there. The crack opens slightly in the heat, closes slightly at night, and in doing so it works like a mechanical pump on the fracture. Each cycle can widen the joint a little more. This is not speculation pulled from thin air. Measurements in Yosemite have shown that large detached granite slabs can visibly respond to daily temperature changes. In one study, a partially detached slab was found to open and close by nearly half an inch, or about 12 millimeters, over the course of a day. That is not a trivial movement for a block of stone. Another study measured an unstable slab bulging and moving outward by about 8 millimeters, or roughly 1/3 of an inch, on a hot afternoon. Those numbers are small enough to seem harmless in isolation. But the rock does not care about human intuition. It cares about accumulated stress. Repeated flexing can grow a crack until the remaining rock can no longer carry the load. That is why the Royal Arch's crack was treated as an active hazard. Once the fissure became large enough to detach a pillar of rock, the cliff was no longer just a cliff. It was a cliff with a failed or failing support zone. The danger was not theoretical. If the detached section fell, it could release a large mass of granite and send debris downslope. In Yosemite, that matters because the cliffs sit above trails, climbing routes, and talus chutes that can carry broken rock farther than people expect. A rockfall is not just a stone dropping straight down. It is a rapid release of energy, often followed by bouncing blocks, shattered fragments, and the kind of impact that can injure anyone below. That is why the area was closed. The unusual part of this event was not that Yosemite has rockfall. Rockfall is ordinary there, in the geological sense. The unusual part was how the rock was behaving while people watched it. Reports described pieces of granite rattling down the crack without touching the sides in a normal way, as if the opening itself had become a moving boundary. Geologists listening to the cliff heard active cracking, like brittle ice under stress. That kind of sound indicates that the crack was still growing and that the slab was still adjusting. A rock face that is actively cracking is a rock face in motion, even if that motion is measured in millimeters. In geology, tiny motion matters because it is the first visible step toward a larger failure. To picture the crack geologically, imagine a large granite sheet attached to the rest of the wall along a long, narrow zone of weakness. At first, the sheet may be held in place by friction and by a few remaining strong bonds. Then, thermal expansion, moisture, or internal stress opens the joint a little. As the crack grows, the contact area shrinks. The slab loses support. Stress redistributes to the few remaining anchor points. The more the sheet flexes, the more the crack propagates, because the stress at the crack tip becomes intense. This is classic fracture mechanics. Cracks do not simply sit there. They concentrate stress at their tips, and that concentrated stress makes them more likely to lengthen. Once the geometry becomes favourable, the growth can accelerate. That is likely why the crack was considered dangerous even before any major collapse occurred. A partially detached pillar behaves differently from intact rock. It can vibrate, shift, shed chips, and fail unpredictably. The risk is not only from the main block, but from the smaller fragments that break loose first. Those fragments can indicate that the internal friction holding the pillar in place is being lost. In a cliff environment, small rock chips are often the warning signs that a larger block is becoming unstable. Yosemite rangers and geologists were right to treat this as an active event rather than a static crack to be ignored. The wider Yosemite story is that the whole valley is shaped by this same mix of processes. The valley walls are steep because glaciers carved them. The granite is jointed because tectonics, cooling and unloading produced fractures. Weathering works into those fractures, especially where water can seep in. Thermal cycling adds a daily push and pull. Frost wedging can open joints during cold periods. Vegetation can pry apart cracks over longer periods. Earthquakes can trigger failures when the system is already near breaking. And gravity never stops. Gravity is the final reason every cracked slab eventually falls. It does not create the fracture, but it decides the direction of failure once the rock has been weakened enough. That is why Yosemite can be both beautiful and unstable at the same time. The same processes that made the cliffs dramatic are the ones that continue to change them. Rockfall debris at the base of the walls is not a sign of decay in a simple sense. It is evidence that the landscape is still being made. Talus piles, fresh scarps, and new fractures are all part of the ongoing adjustment. The cliffs are not static monuments. They are active boundaries between intact granite and the forces trying to break it apart. Royal Arches is a striking example because it sits at the intersection of several of those processes. The granite there is ancient, strong, and beautifully exposed, but it is also cut by joints that make it vulnerable. The valley's glacial history steepened the wall. The surface exposure made thermal cycles more effective. Weathering worked into the cracks, and then one of those cracks propagated enough to become visible almost overnight. From a human point of view, that can feel sudden and strange. From a geological point of view, it is sudden only at the surface. The rock may have been weakening for years. That is the deeper answer to what the 200-foot crack really was. It was not a mystery fissure unrelated to the mountain. It was a surface expression of a growing fracture in a granite pillar, most likely along a sheeting joint or exfoliation plane. It looked dark, jagged, and nearly vertical because it was cutting through the cliff face along a plane of weakness that had been activated by stress. It was dangerous because it marked partial detachment of a large mass of rock that could fall without much warning. It was probably caused by the interaction of pre-existing joints, unloading from erosion and glaciation, weathering, thermal expansion, and the mechanical growth of the fracture itself. In other words, the crack was not a one-off event. It was a snapshot of Yosemite's geology in motion. And that is what makes the story worth paying attention to. Yosemite is often described as timeless, but its cliffs are not timeless at all. They are changing right now. Every hot day, every cold night, every wet season, every freeze-thaw cycle, every small movement along a joint adds a little more strain. The granite does not shatter all at once. It peels, flexes, whispers, and finally breaks. Royal Arches simply gave people a rare chance to hear that process happening. The crack looked sudden because the mountain chose that moment to show its work. So the 200-foot crack was not a random tear in the cliff, and not a sign that Yosemite had become unstable in some new way. It was the visible edge of a very old process, granite fractured by tectonics, exposed by uplift and erosion, steepened by glaciers, weakened by weathering, and nudged toward failure by heat and stress. That is the geology of Yosemite in one event. And if there is a lesson in it, it is that even the strongest-looking cliff is still part of a living rock system, one that keeps changing long after people have decided it should be finished.